I woke up to the sound of slogans being shouted outside the window. Young voices full of conviction cutting through the morning air. Serve the people. Defend the nation. Dedicate your youth without regret. The words struck me like a physical blow. My fingers trembled as I sat up abruptly, my chest heaving as if I'd just surfaced from deep water. The room around me was small, old, and unbearably familiar. A wooden cabinet scarred by years of use stood against the wall. A red-painted thermos with peeling edges sat on the table beside a chipped enamel mug. And above it all hung a calendar with bold red characters announcing October, 1976. My vision blurred as recognition settled in. I knew this room. I had lived here once before, nearly half a century ago. I stumbled out of bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror. A young woman stared back at me. Her face smooth and unlined, eyes clear, hair braided neatly down her back. She looked no older than 20. Not the worn, exhausted woman in her late 60s who had died alone in a rented apartment, clutching a bank book no one would ever open. My knees weakened. I had been reborn. Fate had dragged me back to the autumn where everything could still be rewritten. In my previous life, this was the year I had broken myself for a man named Leonard Sue. He had been my fiancé, a rising star in the army, disciplined, aloof, admired wherever he went. He was also the man who ruined my life without ever raising a hand against me. I had loved him blindly, foolishly, with a devotion that erased myself. I gave up my own enlistment opportunities so he could focus on his future. I stayed behind to care for his parents, endured gossip and loneliness, and waited year after year for letters that grew colder and more perfunctory. When he took my enlistment slot and handed it to Yvonne Chen, the woman he had loved since his youth, I still convinced myself I was being generous, that this was what understanding women did. I watched him build his future with her while I scrubbed floors and counted ration tickets. When he was injured and forced to leave the army, I nursed him back to health. When he entered business, I supported him quietly from the shadows. When he finally became successful, he became ashamed of me. And when he openly remarried Yvonne, it was our son, the child I had poured my entire life into, who looked me in the eyes and told me that I had never been worthy of his father. That single sentence crushed what little dignity I had left. I died that winter, the heater broken, the phone silent, my existence ending as quietly as it had been lived. And now somehow I was back. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and insistent. Lin Qiao, are you awake? It was the neighborhood director. I steadied my breathing and opened the door. She looked surprised to see me dressed already, and nodded with approval, telling me to come with her to confirm the enlistment list. My heart tightened painfully. This was the exact moment where I had destroyed my own future last time. We sat across from each other in the small office, the enlistment form lying between us, stamped and official. She looked at me seriously and reminded me that this was the final slot, that once I signed, there would be no turning back. Then her tone softened. Leonard Sue's unit was recruiting this year too, she said, and since we were engaged, wouldn't it be nice to serve together? I stared at the paper for a long time. In my last life, I had smiled shyly and agreed without hesitation. This time, I pushed it back across the table. I told her calmly that I would not enlist. She froze, disbelief written all over her face, reminding me that I had trained for years. I told her I had thought it through, that I wanted to stay and work at the machinery factory instead. When she asked if I was serious, I smiled faintly and said that women held up half the sky, and that industry mattered just as much as the battlefield. The words felt steady and grounding as they left my mouth. In my last life, love had been my entire world. This time, I would build something that belonged to me alone. That evening, Leonard came to my house. He looked exactly as he always had, tall, sharp, immaculate in his uniform, even his frown carrying authority. He handed me a folded document and told me that we needed to postpone the marriage application. His mother, sitting beside him, added coldly that Leonard was at a critical stage, and marriage would only distract him. I listened quietly, then nodded. I said they were right, and that marriage shouldn't be rushed. The room fell into stunned silence. Leonard stared at me as if he'd never truly seen me before. Later that night, he pulled me aside, irritation flickering in his eyes. He told me not to play games, that he would marry me eventually. I looked at him then, really looked at the man who had never once chosen me, only assumed I would always be there. I told him softly that I wasn't playing, that I simply didn't want this anymore. His face darkened and he warned me that I would regret it. I smiled because for the first time I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't. Fate, it turned out, had a strange sense of humor. 3 weeks later, on my way to work, a supply truck lost control near the riverbank. Crates burst open, a pig escaped, and chaos erupted. I ran, slipped, and fell into the river, icy water stealing my breath in an instant. Strong arms pulled me out, clumsy but firm. A soldier stood over me, soaked through, apologizing frantically and asking if I was hurt. When I looked up and met his eyes, memory slammed into me with startling clarity. I had met him once before, in my previous life, when I had traveled thousands of kilometers to beg Leonard not to divorce me. It was this man who had given me food, who had spoken to me kindly when no one else would. His name was Zhou Ming, a logistics soldier from a poor background, honest to a fault. Back then, I hadn't understood the weight of that kindness. This time I did. I married Zhou Ming 6 months later. The neighborhood laughed, Leonard scoffed, and my parents cried. But Zhou Ming stood in front of me like an unmovable mountain. He told me he didn't have rank or influence, but he had loyalty, and he would never let me suffer. And he kept his word. While I built my career in manufacturing, he studied relentlessly. I pushed him toward military school, and he climbed step by step, slow but unshakable. The years passed, the country changed, and so did we. By the time Leonard Su saw me again, I was no longer the woman he could abandon at will. I was the woman he could never reach again. I kept my head down after the wedding, not because I was ashamed, but because I finally understood how dangerous it was to grow too fast without roots. The machinery factory was loud, oily, and exhausting. Nothing like the clean idealism people attach to uniforms and slogans, but it taught me things I'd never learned in my previous life. I learned how to read blueprints until the lines felt like a second language, how to argue for materials without offending the supply office, how to stand my ground when older male technicians dismissed me with a wave of their hand. I stayed late, asked questions, wrote everything down, and when I got home with aching shoulders and grease under my nails, Zhou Ming would already be there, heating water, listening quietly as I talked. He never interrupted, never offered hollow encouragement. He only said, again and again, "You're capable. I believe you." Those words, simple as they were, slowly stitched together parts of me that had been torn apart long ago. Leonard Su, on the other hand, began appearing in my life in ways that felt almost deliberate. At first it was just news passed along by others, his promotion, his commendation, how he and Yvonne Shen were being praised as a model couple. In my previous life, each fragment of information like that had cut me open. This time, I felt only a distant curiosity, like hearing about a stranger whose path had once crossed mine. Still, when I ran into him unexpectedly outside the supply office one afternoon, I felt the subtle shift in the air. He looked at me longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on my plain clothes, my calloused hands. There was something unsettled in his expression, as if the version of me standing in front of him didn't match the one he had filed away in his memory. He asked, casually, whether life was difficult married to a logistics soldier with no background. I smiled politely and told him life was busy, fulfilling, and steady. The word steady seemed to irritate him more than any insult could have. As the years passed, opportunities came quietly, not as gifts but as tests. The factory needed someone to lead a small technical improvement group, and no one volunteered. I did. The proposal I submitted was rejected twice, returned with red ink and dismissive comments, but I revised it each time, sharper and clearer, until they had no reason left to say no. When the upgraded equipment reduced waste and improved output, my name was finally written into the meeting minutes. It wasn't applause, but it was acknowledgement, and in this era, that was everything. I was promoted, then promoted again, my responsibilities expanding alongside my confidence. I learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to compromise and when to refuse. Each step felt earned, grounded, unlike the hollow sacrifices I had made in my previous life for love that never returned the favor. Zhou Ming changed too. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. He studied late into the night, borrowed books from anyone who would lend them, and took every training opportunity offered, no matter how small. I never pushed him with impatience or comparison. I only reminded him of what he wanted to become. When he hesitated, doubting his background, his lack of connections, I told him that discipline and integrity traveled farther than shortcuts ever could. Years later, when he finally stood taller in his uniform, when others began addressing him with respect instead of indifference, I felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with shared effort. We had a child during a time of uncertainty, when resources were tight and futures unclear. In my previous life, motherhood had been a one-way devotion that drained me dry. This time it was different. Zhou Ming never treated childcare as my burden alone. He learned how to hold, feed, soothe, and teach with the same seriousness he applied to his duties. When our child took their first steps, we were both there. When they spoke their first words, they looked between us, secure in the knowledge that love was not conditional or hierarchical. I watched that small, ordinary happiness with an ache that was both painful and healing, knowing how rare it truly was. The first time Leonard Su truly lost his composure in front of me was at a regional meeting years later. By then, I was representing the factory on a technical exchange panel, my name listed alongside men who once wouldn't meet my eyes. Leonard attended in his official capacity, his expression tightening when he saw me take my seat. During a break, he approached me and remarked, not unkindly but not sincerely either, that he hadn't expected me to get this far. I looked at him calmly and replied that neither had I, once, The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, I saw something close to regret flicker across his face, not because he loved me, but because he had misjudged me. That realization, I understood, would haunt him longer than any argument ever could. Yvonne Shen appeared shortly after, her smile flawless, her posture composed. She spoke to me as if we were old acquaintances, commenting on how different life turned out. I nodded and agreed. Different, but not unfortunate. She laughed lightly, perhaps expecting bitterness, perhaps hoping to confirm some quiet victory. When she realized there was none to be found, her expression stiffened almost imperceptibly. I wished her well, sincerely, and turned away. Walking back to my seat, I felt something loosen inside my chest, a knot I hadn't known was still there finally dissolving. By the time reform winds truly swept through the country, I was ready. I had experience, credibility, and an instinct for timing that I had paid dearly to acquire. When the factory was restructured, I didn't cling to sentiment or fear. I stepped forward with a plan, gathered a small team, and moved into a new space that blurred the line between state and market. It was risky, exhausting, and often terrifying. But it was mine. Zhou Ming supported the decision without hesitation, adjusting his own path so we could weather uncertainty together. We argued, we compromised, we recalibrated, but we never undermined each other. That, I learned, was what partnership truly meant. Years later, when Leonard Su's career stalled and rumors began circulating about misjudgments and missed opportunities, people expected me to feel vindicated. I didn't. I felt only a quiet distance, like looking at a crossroads I had once stood at and chosen to leave behind. The difference between us was never fate or luck. It was choice, repeated daily, often painfully, often without witnesses. I had chosen myself when it mattered most, and in doing so, I had chosen a life that didn't require regret as its foundation. Standing at the window one evening, watching the city lights flicker on, I realized that rebirth hadn't given me a perfect life. It had given me clarity. Love that didn't demand erasure. Work that didn't punish ambition. A future that didn't depend on someone else's approval. And that, more than anything, was the second chance I had been given.